Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here for part two of today's three-part event on the work of Professor Adom Getachew. She will speak to us in this session about her new project, about her current project called Garveyism and the Practices of Pan-Africanism. I will simply proceed to introduce her and then hold a discussion or host the discussion as we go afterward. Professor Getachew is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago. Her blockbuster book, World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, came out in 2019 with Princeton and is one of the most significant works of Black intellectual history and also global intellectual history of political theory based on a long repressed canon and of the current rethinking of empire and international thought and power to have appeared in a very long time. I guess there's a long list, but nonetheless, it's important in every one of these. She treats world making in the political thinking of figures like Nkrumah, Padmore, Nyerere, Eric Williams, Du Bois, and many others in a way is to bring forth how world making was involved at once in national self-determination, in the investment in national self-determination, and in the imagination and establishment of a new global order unfettered by post-colonial domination. As she writes, bridging the historical with the political in that book, quote, the central lessons of anti-colonial world making, that hierarchy rather than sovereign equality structures the international order, that non-domination must be a central principle of a post-imperial international order, and that a commitment to non-domination enhances rather than detracts from internationalism. The central lessons of anti-colonial world-making can inform our own projects of world-making. At Chicago, she is intimately involved in the reform of the university and the formation of the new Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity. And she is now also the editor of two collections of writings, one on W.E.B. Du Bois's International Thought, which just appeared with Cambridge Text in the History of Political Thought, and which she co-edited with Jennifer Pitts, and also of Imagining Global Futures, which is out as of 2 weeks ago with Boston Review Books. So please join me in welcoming Adom Getachew into the remark and Sigu. Oops, sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to join you and to discuss a new book project tentatively titled The Universal Race, Garveyism, and the Practices of Pan-Africanism. Before I start, I just want to thank Steph for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be engaged in such serious conversation over the course of a full day. I also want to thank Sam, who got me here and who organized this whole event. And thanks to all of you for bearing the cold on a Friday and coming out. Okay, so what I want to do today is lay out the really broad contours of this book project. But before arriving there, I'd like to say something about the aims of the first book in order to situate where my work is going. So World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination was my effort to think through the internationalism of formal decolonization. Drawing on a range of Black Atlantic intellectuals and statesmen, I sought to unearth the ambitious visions of international order anti-colonial nationalists articulated. While decolonization is deeply associated with the universalization of national sovereignty as the norm of global politics, world making revised the standard narrative to argue that anti-colonial visions of self-determination exceeded the national frame and were first and foremost projects of remaking the international order. My effort to tell the story was driven by a wider interest in Black internationalism and Pan-Africanism. I wanted to chart what became of this internationalism at the high point of decolonization. And I was especially concerned to highlight the institutional imaginaries that emerged from the decolonizing world. As a result, that book dwells extensively on international institutions like the UN and efforts to found regional federations. In doing so, it sought to highlight a tradition of theorizing international politics within Black Atlantic political thought. That is, it explored how the histories of transatlantic slavery, as well as the experiences of imperial expansion and the global color line, produce distinctive accounts of sovereignty and the meaning of international equality. Yet, reflecting on that book now, I think there were two central limitations to my approach in world making. First, given its emphasis on the period of formal decolonization, it really could not get around the nation state. That is, the internationalism to which it attends is primarily an internationalism of states. But these now, so it's to be sure, there were various non-statist and subaltern forms of internationalism that did persist into the post-war period. But these now operated in a landscape of new nation states, shaping the terms of both Third Worldism and Pan-Africanism. And there's really very important moments, for instance, the Sixth Pan-African Congress in Dar es Salaam, where these kind of statist and non-statist versions of Pan-Africanism met, and you could see the real conflicts that emerged. The second limitation, as I see it now, is that given the focus on interstate internationalism and institution building, it also privileged the high politics of decolonization and the elite political actors who occupied these spaces. As a result, the popular politics of decolonization disappears entirely from view. In this project, The Universal Race, I turn to Garveyism as an alternative site for a reconsideration of Pan-Africanism that I hope overcomes these two limitations. Named after the Jamaican Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey, Garveyism encapsulated a broad range of political ideas and practices that centered on racial emancipation and equality, and emerged from an analysis of white supremacy that linked the conditions of racial domination in the United States to imperial rule across the world. The institutional heart of the movement was the Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, which Garvey co-founded with Amy Ashwood in 1914 in Kingston, Jamaica. A decade later, there would be over 1,000 separate local divisions of the UNIA, concentrated in the United States and the Caribbean, but extending to Southern and Western Africa and as far as Sydney, Australia. The precise count of members during its height in the early 1920s is difficult to pinpoint, but at least one estimate by the leading historian and archivist of the movement, Robert Hill, suggests that at least 6 million counted themselves among the ranks of the UNIA. And even when they were not card-carrying members of the organization, Garveyites, as they called themselves, claimed a part in what they understood to be a global struggle against racial hierarchy and imperialism. As with the parallel pan-racial movements of the period, from Pan-Asianism to Pan-Islamism, Garveyism did not have a specific institutional picture of the post-imperial world. At times, it advanced an idea of a Black nation state that echoed 19th century emigrationist projects. At others, it articulated a vision of a globe-spanning Negro empire. More generally, it proposed self-help, racial pride, economic self-determination as central to the project of emancipation. As the invocation of improvement included in the name UNIA indicated, Garveyism incorporated a broad repertoire of self-strengthening practices that was understood as both means towards the goal of emancipation and ends in themselves. In this project, I'll be interested in considering how race, and especially Blackness, engendered a scalar imagination and operated in a space between empire and nation. As the project of intellectual history, the Universal Race relocates the intellectual and political origins of Garveyism in a decidedly imperial frame, highlighting the crises of imperial citizenship in the West Indies and the articulations of anti-racist critique in West Africa as central sources of Garveyism's international politics. As a political theory of a mass movement, it departs from an examination of the political thought of discrete thinkers, the approach of my first book, to center and highlight specific political practices. And the shift to practices is designed to capture questions of affiliation, attachment, and identification. So with that, now let me dive in. Okay. All right. In the June 14, 1924 issue of the Negro World, the weekly newspaper of the Garveyite movement, An open letter under the title, West African Chief Translates Liberty Hall Speeches for Native Consumption appeared. The letter was from Chief Kojo Taki of Amonfoposi, Gold Coast, now Ghana. Allow me space in the most valuable paper of today to say a few words to my fellow Black men, his letter opens. He relays how he had heard about the weekly newspaper from a one Mr. H.B. Hall of Waleetka, Oklahoma. The correspondence with Mr. Hall, access to the Negro world, and the very letter through which he addresses his fellow Black men are made possible, he tells us, by the reading and translation of his clerk. Through the clerk's mediation, he hears of the grand meetings organized by the UNIA in New York. And this is a reference to the annual conventions that were held every August. I wish I were there, he writes. But where physical presence isn't possible, the Negro world serves as a crucial link. I am the only chief on the coast here who is a subscriber, he informs his readers. But to reveal its precious secrets to all the people, I have entrusted the work of translation unto the kind care of my native ministers, who have to read and translate the speeches to the chiefs and their subjects. So I've been very fascinated with this letter, and I've been trying to locate Chief Taki, but so far those efforts have yielded very little. So the town he names, Amonfoposi, according to a historian of colonial Ghana, Sarah Balakrishnan, is a really common name. It translates in Akan languages to country people forcibly separated, and it would be the name for a variety of newly formed towns in this period. But thanks to the Schomburg Library, we can identify that Chief Kojo Taki was in fact a registered member of the UNIA. So this is the list of international members. He's listed in this particular file. This is from 1926. And it locates him near the harbor town of Salt Pond in the Gold Coast. And Salt Pond would be a really important nexus for the circulation of the Negro World, a newspaper. The letter's mention of Mr. Hall of Waleetka, Oklahoma, who introduced Chief Taki to the Negro world, gives us a different clue about the relations and circulation that culminated in his open letter. So a decade earlier, Waleetka, Oklahoma had been a key node in the short-lived Africa movement. Initiated by Chief Alfred Sam, also of the Gold Coast in 1912, the Africa movement sought to encourage African-American emigration to the Gold Coast and to build commercial links between the West African coast and African Americans. Alfred Sam was born in 1881 in the Gold Coast, where he received religious training and a business apprenticeship in shipping through the Basel Mission. He was engaged in commodity trade that took him to the United States, the Caribbean, and Europe. And after a religious experience in New York, he began raising funds for a ship to engage this project of emigration. So this movement, short-lived as it was, revived interest in emigration among African Americans, and among 200 emigration clubs were formed, especially in all Black towns in states like Oklahoma and Florida. Waleetka, Oklahoma was the site of its tent city, where those desiring to travel to the Gold Coast awaited passage. And in anticipation of their emigration, they named their city South Gold Coast. So I dwell on the set of relations because it crystallizes so centrally how Garveyism was cultivated through older circuits and networks of Pan-Africanism. I conceptualize Garveyism in the project as an interregnum formation. On the one hand, it carried into 20th century Victorian ideals of self-help and self-improvement. It built on and reignited the dream of African redemption, championed by advocates of emigration in the 19th century. It often built very directly on the institutions that had existed in those earlier moments. So, for instance, places in the United States which had had emigration clubs or exodus societies would also be the places where Garveyism flourished. So So it has this like continuity with these earlier formations. On the other hand, Garveyism marked the reconstitution of Pan-Africanism as a mass movement. And I think this is the central intervention Garveyism makes in the tradition of Pan-Africanism. Garveyites self-consciously embraced the project of building a mass movement. And they understood this first in scalar terms. Garveyism was, according to Garvey, a universal rather than a national movement. It was to be globe spanning and to articulate a Black world. But the embrace of mass movement also signaled Garveyism's interest in strategies and practices of transforming the mass into an agent of politics. And in this effort, ideas of self-help and self-improvement accrued a new meaning, tied in particular to engendering a sense of political empowerment. So for Chief Taki, this very process of articulating a Black world, of building a sense of a newly empowered collectivity, was already a triumph. So as he would put it in his letter, many people speak of a victory to come, but as for me, I say it is already here. So not the victory to come, but that which is already here. I find this suggestive, for it asks us to reconsider the aims and ends of Garveyism. If we take the project as an effort to revive emigration or found a Black state, Garveyism cannot be anything but a failure. The ambitious shipping line, the Black Star Line, meant to foster commercial and migratory linkages, never fully got off the ground. The UNIA's overtures to the Liberian state and its efforts to relocate its base there were rebuffed by Liberian officials. In fact, an editorial published in the Sierra Leone Weekly News on the same day as Chief Taki's letter appeared in the Negro World predicted that Garvey's, quote, wild conception of a Negro republic in Africa will fail. It is bound to fail ignominiously. But it continued by arguing that the movement's seed thought is that wherein there is any hope for Negroes, whether in America or Africa. Both of these framings, the victory that had already come and the seed thought planted on both sides of the Atlantic, are opportunities to view Garveyite practices not as means to an end, but as ends in themselves. What I want to explore with you today, and what my book, The Universal Race, will examine on a wider canvas, is that the idea of the victory that had already come. I want to just suggest that Garveyism innovated a particular way of seeing the imperial world and of producing a new political agent, the universal Negro. So 2 images of Africa from the Negro World newspaper will guide my account. The first is this depiction of the Black Atlas, which was also on the flyer for today's program. In a reference to the Greek myth of Atlas, who is condemned to stand at the western edge of the world and hold up the sky on his shoulders, Africa, personified as a loincloth-clad muscular and masculine figure, stands statuesque here, supporting the world. On the one hand, this image depicts a central thesis of Pan-Africanist thought, that Africa is the foundation of the modern world. Foregrounded in the globe he carries is the Western Hemisphere, where enslaved African labor produced the commodities that fueled commercial expansion and industrialization. In the context of the late 19th century and early 20th century, the image of Atlas holding up the sky was central to socialist and trade union iconography that represented labor, again personified as a man, shackled to and burdened by his overlords. Now, these 2 are both from the Negro Call, and they have come from before the decade before Garveyism exploded between 1918 and 1922. I've been very interested in the kind of overlapping imagery of the UNIA and various socialist and trade unions formations of the same period. And I think it's an opportunity for us to think about the ways in which Garveyism, like socialism and other mass movements of the period, or to think about Garveyism in relationship to socialist and other mass movements of the same period. So what's interesting, though, in relation to these 2 images is that in this imagining, the same iconography positions Africa in the role of bearing the world, but unlike the laborer who is bent over, Africa stands upright and defiant. Moreover, given the ways that the figure's head here is displaced by the globe, we might also see in this image a claim for the ways in which Africa names a particular way of sensing and imagining the world. The continent produces a new map of the world, a black atlas. And key to the mapping of this a black atlas was the tethering together of a scattered race that shares a common political predicament, what Garvey describes as a common grievance and a common complaint. This was an effort at producing commensurability across vast national, linguistic, and cultural difference. Africa constitutes here a deterritorial space of political coordination. And this would be a relatively new conception of the continent within the tradition of Pan-Africanism. So if we look back, for instance, at figures like Edward Blyden, who Garvey cited as an important influence, we find an image of Africa that is displaced to the past and future. A champion of African immigration, Blyden envisioned the continent as a space of arrested development, one that required the world historical and redemptive agency of the exiled sons and daughters of Africa. The positioning of Africa as past homeland and future site of racial redemption displaced or distorted a sense of a co-present Africa. What is significant then about the Black Atlas image is that it recasts the temporality of Africa. No longer bracketed and displaced to past and future, the continent is now the grounds from which a Black map of the world is enacted. The Negro world did not originate this image. Instead, it was already emerging in the early 20th century across a series of both regional and metropolitan newspapers, novels, and other texts. In British West Africa, for instance, papers like the Gold Coast Leader responded to the increasing retrenchment of racial hierarchy and the marginalization of a colonial educated elite by beginning to mobilize the category of Negro to articulate an identification with a transatlantic Black world. So this is the first issue of the Gold Coast Leader from 1902. And in the manifesto to the young people of the country, it really understood itself as directed to the youth or the young. It asked this question about the Negro, right? Who is the Negro? What are the Negro's rights? Oops. The emergence of the Negro as a transnational form of affiliation was facilitated through comparison with the United States, especially. So while initially comparison worked to differentiate America as a particularly egregious site of white supremacy, by the 1910s, this differentiation is dissolved. West African writers begin to import the category of Jim Crow to redescribe the problem of racial hierarchy in the colonies. And I think one really striking and fascinating example is this columnist in the Gold Coast Nation, another paper out of Ghana, who adopts the name the Jim Crow in a series of columns written in 1916, and both adopts that self-reference, but also his columns are really centered on critiquing then kind of increasing racial hierarchy within the colony. So that's an example of this. The focus of much of this coverage in the West African newspapers centered on the introduction of segregation in various sites, in shipping, the creation of all white chambers of commerce, and increasing just overall the increasing delimitation of mobility, both physical mobility and sort of economic mobility. This growing claim of a commensurable experience of racialized hierarchy and the domination was facilitated in these papers through an extended engagement with and reproduction of speeches, reports, and newspaper articles from the United States. Reviews of Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, speeches by Frederick Douglass, and excerpts from the NAACP's annual reports appeared alongside coverage of local and regional news. This practice of what Leslie James has called culling, through which editors assembled sources from the wider British Empire and the United States, facilitated a transatlantic dialogue about the meaning of racial hierarchy across the Anglophone world. Unlike explicit comparison within a specific article, culling drew connections more implicitly by setting the local and the global alongside each other. So the Negro world takes up these very practices of comparison and culling. Consider this headline from the September 27, 1924 issue. Through two columns on either side of the page, framed by this title, Ways of the Tyrant, the reader is enjoined to view New Guinea and Nigeria as sites of a commensurable experience of imperial tyranny. The story on New Guinea emphasizes the brutal police practices unleashed by the Australian Mandate government, and it focuses especially on the harassment and sexual violation of Indigenous women. The article on Nigeria is also interested in colonial oppression, but here focuses on the taxation, monopoly, and imperial trade preferences that burden native peasants and traders. While these articles track very different forms of imperial tyranny, two features are foregrounded to evidence commensurability. First, both sides are identified as part of a British imperial world, characterized as a space of increasing domination and exploitation. Neither article directly draws from the victims of imperial tyranny, but redeploys the criticisms of an Englishman and the reporting of a colonial official to document the experience of domination. We see in this a kind of reoccurring strategy that comes up across the paper of imminent critique, where the evidence of colonial domination is read through the colonial record itself. Second, the two articles make clear that this domination is structured by racial hierarchy. And in doing so, it mobilizes the category of Black, not just for those who are of African origins and descent, but also for the indigenous peoples of New Guinea, who are also identified as Black in this article. And that definition or mobilization of Black would also be applied in articles on the experience of Indigenous Australians in other issues of the paper. So the stretching of Blackness, the mapping of a Black world through the experience of racialized forms of domination and exploitation helped to foster the founding of the UNIA chapter in Sydney, Australia, which was a collaboration between West Indian sailors and Indigenous Australians. What I want to emphasize here is the ways that the image of a Black world is reiteratively conjured through practices of comparison that produce a sense of commensurability. And I use sense here very intentionally, for what the Negro world and the UNIA more broadly aimed at was a re-education of the senses, and especially the sense of perception. As Garvey would put it in 1921, it was a difficult proposition to get Negroes to see through one common spectacle. We can take the spectacle here to mean an instrument, a prosthetic eye, employed to aid or supplement a limited capacity for perception. The Negro world was one such ocular instrument. It allowed readers to, quote, see through Black spectacles, as this reoccurring column would put it. And to see through Black spectacles was to decode the color line, to understand oneself in relation to a wider world. And this was not simply an analytic exercise of cognizing imperial tyranny. It was also the site for constituting new subjectivities, for engendering an image of oneself as an empowered political agent. The remapping of the world through a Black spectacle, the constitution of a Black map of the world, is intimately tied to the second meaning of the universal race. And here the universal race names for me a political actor endowed with epoch-making political capacities. And I'm taking inspiration here, of course, from the universal Negro of the UNIA. The universal Negro, like its counterpart and sometimes synonym, the new Negro, was a figure distinguished by a newly discovered political consciousness, radicalized and awakened in large part owing to a growing internationalism. The universal Negro was politically empowered, capable of remaking the South and the world. So this brings me to the second image of Africa I would like to discuss, which also appeared in the Negro world. Here we have another personification of Africa, this time larger than life, imposing and threatening. He has broken his own chains and wields what appears both like a spear and a pen, emblazoned with the word recognition. The smaller figures in the image disperse, fleeing as this figure makes his mark on the world. I should pause here and remark on the masculinism of these two images of Africa we've seen. As Michelle Stevens has noted, the interwar efforts of Garvey and others to fashion Blackness as a global formation and consciousness circulated through gendered representations and ideologies. For instance, the UNIA's recurring reference to the Black Star Line to the Black soldier as the model of political empowerment rendered the universal Negro a masculine and martial subject. This gendering also shows up in the appellation fellow men of the Negro race, with which Garvey opened his weekly Negro World editorials, and it is also echoed in the letter that I started with from Chief Taki. Now, I think there's a very interesting gender politics to the UNIA because women were very active, especially in local chapters. Local chapters had both male and female presidents, and in various ways, despite the kind of self-presentation of the movement, women were able to carve out important spaces for themselves and transform the structures of the organization. And they would do so in part by positioning themselves as the universal Negro, right? Making themselves the primary referent of this figure. So as to trace the making of this new agent, the universal Negro, I track practices, repertoires, and rituals that constitute the reiterative sites through which this figure is enacted. In previous work, for instance, I examined the spectacular annual conventions, and I argued there that mass parades and stately deliberations were forms of auto-spectacle, through which Garveyites produced an image of themselves as a newly empowered collectivity. It's crucial, however, and this is what I want to focus on here, that these more spectacular and rarer events sit alongside the more routine rituals of political assembly that Garveyites practiced. So the local UNIA chapters each had a Liberty Hall, which would be where meetings were held. Meetings would be held every Sunday, and they followed a particular script, which included the singing of the UNIA anthem, other musical selections, followed by speeches and debates that were decided by the local leaders of the chapter. At these gatherings, Garveyites wore either uniforms of the various auxiliary groups or their church clothes. The regularity and ritual character of these settings afforded opportunities for what E. Franklin Frazier calls self-magnification. Although ultimately critical of Garveyism, Frazier credited Garvey with building the first mass movement among American Negroes. The movement's capacity to attract mass participation, unlike the NAACP and the Urban League, Frazier insisted, had less to do with its political program than the ways it opened space for self-magnification through invented honors and social distinctions. Even if honorifics like knighthoods were limited to a select few, fellow UNIA members were addressed as fellow men of the Negro race and had the opportunity to participate in concrete distinctions through gendered organizations like the African Legion and the Black Cross Nurses. In this context, Frazier writes, the Negro porter who during the day takes orders from white men can become an officer in the Black Army when it's assembled at night in Liberty Hall. I think this phrase self-magnification is really interesting, but I think it's much more than about the sort of, Frazier focuses a lot on the kind of self-fashioning, the sartorial self-fashioning and the forms of kind of honorifics. But I wanted to draw on a particular oral history to think about what else self-magnification might do. So Elma Lewis, the daughter of Barbadian immigrants to Boston, whose parents were UNIA members, describes this experience of self-magnification and her experience in the UNIA in the following ways. Her father joined the UNIA, she tells us, after he had been passed up for a promotion at the docks where he worked. A British subject, he had hoped that the English foreman would award him the promotion as a fellow national, but he was passed up for a Polish co-worker. Having encountered the racist element in society, Lewis's father abandoned his early commitment to Booker T. Washington's vision of self-help and joined the UNIA. So Lewis would then attend meetings, and she describes them in these ways. The UNIA had a meeting every Sunday. They had a program at 3 p.m. We'd go to church in the morning, went to Sunday school, come home, have our dinner, and then we went to the UNIA meetings. At a young age, she remembers reciting poetry in the context of these meetings. Quote, I had a very strong cultural identity from the beginning, and it was not very possible for me to be denigrated because I always had a strong sense of self, always. And I had been encouraged in my teaching and in my directing of people to give them that same sense. That liberates. So this self-magnification was not just about racist denigration or countering racist imagery. Instead, it also produced, as Lewis notes, a sense of oneself in a global frame. She says, the Garvey movement was a worldwide experience. For Lewis, self-magnification was in the sense a scalar experience. You began to see yourself as part of a worldwide experience, or you saw yourself on a global stage. So reciting poetry like Lewis, listening to or delivering speeches and engaging in political debate were central and recurring practices of UNIA membership. In particular, the mastery of political speech and rhetoric was viewed as necessary to the task of self-improvement and self-empowerment. And Garveyites generated many avenues for members to practice these political skills within the course of a meeting, but also in UNIA organized literary and debating societies, as well as elocution contests. So consider another oral history, this time with Sylvia Woods, who grew up in the UNIA in New Orleans before becoming a really important labor leader in Chicago. So her family joined the UNIA in 1919, and her father took her to weekly meetings in New Orleans and encouraged her to listen to the woman speaker who opened the meeting every week. He wanted Sylvia to, quote, hear every word so that she would be able to speak like that woman. We have to have speakers in order to get free. And then when he got home, she says, he would say, now what did she say? And I would just say, could say it just like her, with her same voice, all of her movements and everything. So the practice of transforming yourself by reiterating and rehearsing the models of political action and political speech on display within the organization hints in an important way to a distributed vision of race leadership that Garveyism made possible. To be sure, of course, Garvey himself embodied and reinforced a model of race leadership centered on the figure of the race man himself. And in many ways, his charismatic leadership continued to be resonant for many Garveyites. Yet alongside his overwhelming presence, Garveyites always also envisioned the UNIA as a site for incubating political leaders by instilling specific political habits. Mamie Damena, who is the leader of the UNIA division in Nicaragua, and challenged the UNIA to make more institutional space for women, put this point sharply. Speaking on the occasion of Garvey's release from prison, she insisted, every day a Marcus Garvey is born, meaning that Garveyites beget Garveyites, and the supply of them was always being replenished by new births. And these new births, of course, are about the political processes through which Garveyites are inculcated. So even as she continued by encouraging audiences to hold Garvey close, she says they should display his photographs in their homes. She also insisted on the proliferation of political leadership within the UNIA. And local practices of political assembly were sites where Garveyites came to exercise new political habits, engender specific orientations and dispositions, and embody their own political empowerment. So if the universal Negro was a figure distinguished by the Promethean power of self-creation and self-emancipation, it was constituted by practices, both routine and spectacular, through which Garveyites came to recognize themselves as constituting this figure. The shift towards an examination of political practice foregrounds self-education as a central element of Garveyism's mass politics. Reading the Negro World, attending weekly meetings or the annual conventions, and participating in the reading clubs, debating societies, and elocution contexts that form the daily fabric of Garveyism were pedagogical exercises. So this is a way to understand what improvement means, is the improvement reference in the Universal Negro Improvement Association. On the one hand, the centrality of improvement reveals, as I noted at the beginning, Garveyism's deep indebtedness to the political languages of the 19th century. In Victorian England and across the empire, mutual improvement associations sought to instill intellectual capacity and moral rectitude among members with the aim of performing civic citizenship in a context where political enfranchisement was still limited. Largely composed of the lower middle and upper working classes, these societies by the middle of the 19th century stressed the arduous labor of self-improvement and delimited the aspiration to the heroic autodidact. In the same period, African-American conceptions of racial uplift and self-help sought to distinguish the better classes from the Black masses and envisioned Black politics as an elite-led pedagogical project. Black uplift drew directly on Victorian sensibilities, especially in the embrace of the patriarchal family as the moral cornerstone of improvement. Now, Garveyism and other leaders embraced versions of this Victorian inheritance, but the improvement of the UNIA was also a renovated and transformed conception. First, it was democratized. And by this, I do not mean only that its social base included working class people, although it did. Instead, what I mean to suggest is that its barriers of entry were relatively low. And while reiteration and replication, Sylvia Woods reiterating the speeches, for instance, were central, these were never envisioned as barriers to mass entry. Second, although leadership and especially the central role of Garvey himself cannot be diminished, Garveyism was a decentralized formation. The divisional structure of the organization offered a modular institutional form. Flexible in content, it allowed multiple points of entry and a broader range of arenas to experiment with and experience new forms of self-fashioning. Third, and most importantly, the aim of improvement was directed not only toward the cultivation of moral rectitude, and that lay at the center of the Victorian ideal of improvement and racial uplift, but rather at creating and enacting political empowerment. Improvement in this sense named the self-transformation and self-emancipation produced through political education. So this was, on the one hand, an intellectual education in which Garveyites debated and discussed the political and economic conditions of the Negro race, learning and generating a critical vocabulary that decoded the global color line. They swapped reading suggestions, offered history lessons, and came to consider their insular context in a global frame. As one letter to the editor of the Negro World puts it, Garvey aims at pulling the scale from the eyes of Negro peoples. His is the clarion voice calling upon the Negro peoples of the world at large to wake up from their centuries-old somnolescence and lethargy and take their place in the vanguard of peoples. This call is preeminently one of self-consciousness, both individual and racial. So this practice of political education, however, was not simply intellectual and ideological. Having attended a speech and discussion session with Garvey in Panama in 1927, Sidney Young, who wanted to remain detached but found himself an animated participant, concluded, "Garveyism is not a doctrine, it is a formula for life." Entering an essay competition, Why I Am a Garveyite in 1926, Hilda Thompson similarly declared, "Garveyism is light and life." Cultivating specific dispositions and habits, Garveyites performed and embodied their own political empowerment. As a Garveyite, Cyril Solomon of Cuba argued, I have more opportunities to demonstrate my ability in Negro statesmanship, diplomacy, literature, history, and science. In these rituals of assembly and practices of oratory and literacy, Garveyites developed political skills and enhanced a sense of their own political agency. For Samuel Culmer of Miami, Garveyism has caused me to see myself on a larger scale. It makes me feel as a man among men. The reiterative practices that produce this sense of political efficacy and empowerment might be considered a form of prefigurative politics. This was not because Garveyism's practices represented in embryonic form the shape of an anti-imperial politics to come. Indeed, the concrete institutional form that this goal might remained very much undecided. But the practices of self-education were prefigurative in the sense that they embodied a vision of self-determination as an internally oriented, individual and collective project of self-transformation and self-emancipation. So when Chief Taki celebrates the victory that has already come in his January 1922 letter, we should understand him to mean the cumulative effects of these practices of self-education. If the victory to come was as yet unknown and uncertain, the victory that was already here represented an ingression of the future into the present. The constitution of a Black world, then enactment of an empowered and transnational collectivity, was to be celebrated as an end in itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adom.
All right.